politics, all that good stuff. There's a lot here. Like I said before, if there's anything I've missed at the end, feel free to ask away. I do think it's important, before we dive into all of that, to set the stage a little bit, because I imagine I will say some things today that may not be what you expect to hear. And it will make a lot more sense if we all have the foundation the church gives us. So if we look at Genesis, we see the story of the fall of man and all of creation, right? And it's not just Adam and Eve that fall. Their sin basically corrupted everything. By them, death entered the world. So we have this broken, imperfect world. And unfortunately, the reality is that rarely are things black and white. There are, of course, some instances where it's pretty clear that this is the right thing and this is the wrong thing. But as I'm sure you are all familiar from your own lives, and great, most of the time, it's not like that. You kind of have to navigate whatever's happening and find the best thing in options that may not feel great. Of course, we're not kicked out into this world by ourselves, left to manage it on our own. We have, of course, God sent His Son, Jesus, who established a church guided by the Holy Spirit that we are all at least working towards. And it's very important, if you haven't picked this up so far, that this is not an individual thing. I'm sure, as you have noticed coming to these services, there is no one person that any of this is about, right? It's not about me, even, standing at the front in my fancy colored vestments or whatever. It's not about the choir and their beautiful singing, right? We're all here doing the same thing together, whether you're over here or at the altar or behind the iconostas or chasing your kids outside, right? We're all here to worship God together, all of us, including the priest. And our salvation, therefore, is together, all of us, as a community. When we struggle, when we have these difficulties in our lives, we don't struggle as individuals. We struggle as a community. Hopefully, it's somewhat obvious that when one person struggles, it's going to cause problems for the rest of the community, right? This is why, although we don't do this today in the very early church, the communal types of sins were confessed aloud. The types of things that damaged all of the people here were worked out together as a community. I think it's probably for the best that we don't do that now, at least in this culture and day and age. But I think we can see the wisdom in where that came from, at least. I understand that in a different time it may work a little better. It's also very important to understand that this world, and therefore all of us and everything in it, are not evil. As we talk about some of these things, it might be easy to devolve a little bit into thinking about the evilness of the world and the goodness of God, right? And that's not what Scripture tells us, right? God looks at His creation and calls it good. All of it, right? And yes, of course, there's a fall, but that doesn't change the fact that He created a good world. We are all inherently good. Of course, we need love and care. Not just us humans, but everything, right? Plants, animals. If you read the lives of saints, you'll see their immense love for all of the world around them. Animals and people and plants, right? It's not just those pilgrims or wanderers that come to them asking for help, but they'll just as quickly go and help an injured animal or tend to their garden as they would to anyone else that comes asking for aid. If God is love, which we believe very firmly, and we are made in His image and likeness, then we are to share that love. I think it's important to keep in mind, again, as we talk about a lot of these things, the story of the woman who is to be stoned for committing adultery. And what does Jesus do?
He says, whoever of you have not sinned could cast the first stone.
Yeah, and then they all leave, and what does He say to the woman?
Sin no more.
Yeah. That is going to be the model you will see for a lot of these things. to say a technical term here, which is situation ethics. Doesn't even know that is off before we get going. It's not a common mode these days, but it's what the church uses. No?
I guess something that to do with situational and applying like a certain lens to that one instance.
Yeah, so again, this is something that's going to come up a lot as we talk about these things, right? We have a standard. We have something that we strive for. But the reality is, not everyone is able to do that all the time. As I'm sure I've talked about before here, almost every person here has a slightly different prayer rule and fasting rule and the times that they commune and don't commune, right? Of course, there are big lists of rules we can look at of the way you're supposed to do these things, but the reality is everyone has their own way of going about it that's unique to their own situation and their own needs. And they don't do it on their own, right? We talk to spiritual father, the priest, usually me, about how to handle that, how that will evolve and change with them as they go along. But despite having this standard, each individual person's situation dictates what they need to be doing. Now, that's never going to change something that is very bad into being something very good, right? There is no instance ever where murder is just going to be a good thing, right? We're never going to say that. It's always going to be bad. But it may be the lesser of several bad options, which is why, for example, it is very different if a priest were to just stab someone versus like running over someone that jumped into the road with their car. Right? We have a legal definition for the difference between those two things. Right? One of them we call murder, and the other we call manslaughter. But in both cases, someone is dead, but we have a different way that we approach that. In one of them, you're going to jail for a long time. In the other, you're still probably doing something, right? You're not just going to walk out of there for free, but it's going to be a very different situation than if you just in cold blood decided, nah, this person needs to go, right? So that is an example in law of situation ethics, sort of. You can read the rest of what I have there for situation ethics, but again, the story of the woman committing adultery, right? She committed adultery. No one was arguing that. But there probably were different circumstances there as there may have been with someone else. And we know that because of the way that Jesus interacts with her, right? Chances are very good that that was not just a cut and dry, she ran off with some random dude. Now, we don't know. It doesn't say. We don't have any way of knowing that for sure. But the reality is the law is pretty clear as to what's supposed to happen with this adultery. And yet that's not what Jesus has allowed us to happen in that moment. All right, so that's situation ethics. I hope that makes sense. A few more things before we really dive into these. So it is also very important for us to understand that what we are talking about when we talk about these things are people in the church. People that are Orthodox or maybe in working towards it. But there are a whole bunch of other people that have no idea what we're doing here. And so we can certainly claim that these things are good. We can certainly, if we want to dabble very lightly into the politics world, we can say that you can vote the way that we think things should be, but we're always going to treat it differently when it's someone out there versus someone in here, right? Especially if they're coming, having spent a life, as pretty much all of you have, doing other things and then coming here, right? We're not going to hold you to the same standard that we will now as you were held to in the past, right? Of course, I put the little quote there, with great power comes great responsibility, right? We know now who Christ is. We know the church, and we know the standard that we should be striving for. So of course, like I said before, you're not just going to instantly do all things. There's still going to be some element of figuring out what makes sense for each of us. But we now know the Good Shepherd, and we're known by him, and we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. All right. The last thing to just get out there, so I've said it, is that all of the things we're about to talk about are deeply nuanced conversations, and there's no way I can dive into all of them to their fullest extent today. I hope that by the time we get to the end, you have a general idea of the way we tend to approach these that you can apply to other things as well. But a reminder, as Orthodox Christians, we don't hate people. That is not an okay response to any of these things. I hope that's very clear. All right. So let's go through all of these bolded hot button topics. And like I said, if there's any more we want to talk about at the end, feel free to bring them up. But starting with abortion. So it is important to make it very clear that we, as the Orthodox Church, follow what it is, the taking of a human life before birth. We preach, we have feast days for the conception of several great saints. So we are very much in the camp that life starts at conception and that you are killing someone. That said, the Church always prioritizes the life of the mother over that of the infant in the womb. So if there is a possibility, which this does happen, where you have to pick a life, the Church picks the life of the mother, which means you may have to take an abortive action. That's just the way it is sometimes. We prioritize the life of the mother, especially if the mother has other children. Who is going to be the mother to those children if she dies, right? You can sometimes replace, but it's never the same, right? So, the Church has to acknowledge that there are circumstances where it is necessary to take an abortive action. That doesn't make it good. That doesn't make it okay. That doesn't even make it right. But we acknowledge that these exist. We have to acknowledge that they exist and that they may happen sometimes. And so the Church has prayers for a woman who has had to have an abortion. And these are not like super modern things, right? These have been around for a little while. Now, we don't mince words in them. We call it what it is, right? The taking of an innocent life. But we understand that, assuming this wasn't just a willy-nilly kind of thing, if this was an actual necessity for some reason, then it was a necessity. Then that's what needed to happen. Yes.
Will that still require like a confession? Even?
Sure.
Yeah. And what's the difference? Because I know in the Catholic Church, I think if you do an abortion, it's like you're excommunicated, I think, or you're in like, big trouble. Is that the same in the Orthodox Church?
So it is important to understand that excommunication is always something you do to yourself. It's never something we do to you. If you don't go to communion for a few weeks, you have excommunicated yourself by not communing. Right? Yes, anytime you do something that you need to go to confession for, that's why it's called the rite of reconciliation. You're being returned back into the church. So, in a very technical sense of the word, sure, you have excommunicated yourself by doing almost anything that you go to confession for. But we just don't make as big of a deal out of these things. People have all sorts of issues that keep them away from the chalice. It happens. If this is the kind of thing that is, being suggested by your doctor and that you are going with the medical advice and it saves you a life, yeah, go to confession. But no one's going to be sitting there, oh, you did what? Right? It's the reality of the world we live in. Sometimes this is a necessity. Something like an ectopic pregnancy, there is simply no way for that to be viable. It's just not. There isn't anything anyone can do, at least right now, with the science we have, to reimplant that. It's not an embryo yet. I don't think it's blastocyst. I don't remember the technical term, but whatever it is at that point. We just can't do that. It's not viable. And if it's left there, it will kill the life, right? So, sure, it's, we would consider there to be a human life there, but there's only one option there. There is only one way to save a life, and we take that. Right? It's not a good thing, but it is what it is. Make sense? All right. Gay marriage. Marriage is always between one man and one woman. So, lest we go down other paths, always one-to-one. And importantly, as they were born, we call marriage the joining of two flesh into one. We also, if you listen to the prayers that are done in the service, we mention having children a lot. And it's not just adopting, which is a wonderful thing, don't get me wrong, but specifically the bearing life within the union, that emulating the life-giving nature of Christ within the sanctity of marriage. So much so that refusal to have children is technically a grounds for divorce. That's not common, obviously. It's one of those things that we tend to just ask from the beginning. You both want kids, right? Okay, good. But technically speaking, if someone, and we're not talking because of some medical issue or whatever, but if you just hate kids, they're annoying and snotty and disease bearers, and you don't want anything to do with them, right? That's not really okay. Now, of course, it is important to recognize that that's not the only thing marriage is for. It is also for the salvation of the two, right? We aren't going to marry two people randomly. It has to be because you need each other as well. It's not a marriage if you're not relying on one another. There is an element of that as well, but it is both. And it's not a marriage if either one of those is not true. The larger issue here, although this is certainly a little bit my own opinion here, is sex outside of marriage, which is a systemic problem, not related specifically to this. Even heterosexual couples, this is a problem for. It's something that when we have people coming into the Orthodox Church that are not married but living together, the mostly standard recommendation is stop it. You're not married. You can't be living together. So it's a rather big deal. It's not the only issue, obviously, here. I hope that's clear. But it is one of the larger issues we have with this, more than anything else. We have a very strict definition of marriage. We in the church don't debate that ever. But again, from our perspective, when people come in or whatever, that the larger issue is the sex outside of marriage thing, which is a massive systemic problem these days. Pause. Questions? Yes.
So, and maybe this, we can get to this after, and
Sure.
you don't have to go into great detail. This is not really something, I'm just more curious. So for people that would come into the church and sort of identify as gay or homosexual, I know that depending, I know nowadays, especially in America, like there's lots of different Christian perspectives on this,
Sure.
all the way to like fully affirming to, maybe even potentially like really hateful. How does the church sort of like think about sort of same-sex attraction and that even just outside of gay marriage, but just
Sure.
homosexuality in general?
So, remember we talked about Genesis at the beginning, right? We were made for one thing, and then our nature was corrupted. Human nature, like everything else, is fallen and broken. We are not perfect as much as we might like to think we are sometimes. And that means that we sin, right? That was not something that happened before, in many different ways. Sometimes it's important to recognize, for example, that drinking to the point of drunkenness is considered to be sinful in the church. And yet there are those with genetic predispositions to that. We acknowledge the fact that this is a bad thing, and also that you are predisposed to this, and we still hold to the same standard. We just know that you might need a little more help along the way. Right? We understand that people are broken, that our nature is broken, that we don't do the things we should do, that we don't work the way we should work. That's why we need Jesus. That's why we need Christ. That's why we need the church. So, people have all sorts of things about them that aren't right. And this is one of them. Does it make it okay because it's natural? No. The order of nature is corrupted right now. It's broken. Not everything that happens out there is a good thing. Well, I hope that's obvious and clear. But that argument of, well, if it happens in nature, it must be good, we do not subscribe to that, right? There's plenty of bad things that happen out there. Of course, the world in general is good. We were created for good, but we do a lot of bad stuff. So, generally speaking, if a couple, for example, wants to be coming into the church, our doors are open to the public. All manner of sinners come into our services on a regular basis. I don't even necessarily fully know what everyone has done, who wants them here, until you give me your full confession if you're converted. If you were going to be seriously considering joining the church, well, we'd have to have some conversations then. We don't have a definition of marriage compatible with that, so we would have to figure something out. It is a very strong tradition in our culture to have communal living that is same-sex. That's just a thing we do regularly. So there are options out there. You also certainly don't, I'm applying monasticism. You don't have to do that, right? There are plenty of people that just aren't married. That's okay. You don't have to get married. Marriage is not some ultimate goal that we are all striving for, right? Some people need it, some don't. That's okay. But yeah, we're broken. Our nature is corrupted. Christ is the only one that can heal that. Very similarly, moving along to the next one, their transgender procedures. I want to make it very clear because I hear people say this kind of thing. It is not a loss of salvation. Let me turn this around a little bit. Is there anything that you can do, or I can do, to lose my salvation, lose the opportunity to be saved?
Is the only one just blaspheming the Holy Spirit just a lifelong thing too?
Yeah.
Or walk away from faith and reject your faith? Reject Christ?
Yes, but you can always come back to the church, right?
That's true, yeah.
Until that has become your lifelong rejection, right? So you hit the nail on the head, right? It's not just a one-time thing. It's not just I took the name of the Lord in vain and therefore I'm done for or whatever, right? It is a lifelong rejection of God where you do not believe that He, as God, has the power to do anything. Right? That's blaspheming the Holy Spirit. As long as you're not doing that, then there is still hope. There is still a possibility for one's salvation, despite whatever else we may do. So it doesn't really matter what gets cut off or changed with hormones. You can still be saved. You can still come to Christ. You may look rather different than you did before, but you can still be saved. You can still come to Christ. You can still repent. If that were the case, that you couldn't lose things and enter the kingdom of heaven, then what would you do for amputees that have, loss of blood that causes a, hand to have to be amputated or something? Or people that fight in battles and have bits of their body blown off, right? Are we just going to say that, well, you lost that arm, so sorry, right? No, that's absurd, right? It's not that we've removed things that somehow causes a problem for us. It isn't good. Our physical bodies are important, right? We're very clear about that in the Orthodox Church. But they're also subject to decay. No one is going to enter the kingdom of heaven with the bodies that they were born with, right? You'll grow, you will develop, you'll cut yourself, you'll burn yourself, you'll fall into all sorts of things, you'll get weird spots on your skin as you get old, right? Everyone's going to enter the kingdom of heaven looking rather different than they came in. That's okay. To be clear, in case I have to, we don't support these procedures, but we live in a society that does. And so we have to be very careful about how we talk about these things, because I think pretty much anyone who is in this world will tell you that, it's in the DSM, right? It's a mental condition that these people are going through. There's a lot of anguish that goes along with this. It's not just normal. And so if we try and just have the response of, just knock it off. Just stop doing that and you'll be fine, right? That clearly isn't going to work, right? Oftentimes these people are on a whole slew of medication to deal with all sorts of stuff. Sometimes there's trauma involved, other times not, right? I want to be very careful not to go too far into putting an entire class of people into a single bucket, because there's a wide variety of reasons that people may go down this path. But the reality is, very few people do it happily, right? It's something that becomes a last option, especially with how expensive it is these days and how much you have to fight insurance to get these things done. So no one is just kind of willy-nilly doing this. It's also important to understand that a lot of these people face rejection from people in their lives in doing this. If someone were to come to church and we respond in the same way, they're never coming back. What good have we done by expressing our disdain for this type of procedure? What have we helped, right? We've not brought anyone closer to Christ. We've not done anything for this person. All we've done is turn them away from it. So, as is the case with all of these things, it's important to understand where we stand. It's important to understand what our position is, but also that people are going to come in whatever condition they're in. And we as a church are a hospital. What good is a hospital if it turns away the sick people, right? So, it's hard, especially with the way certain people expect you to react, knowing that you're a hardline Christian or something like that. People don't expect you to respond in love. They expect you to respond with hateful words and rejection. And it's important, again, because I just want to be very clear, especially because this is streaming, what we believe. We are very firm in our position that we are born with the gender that we have, and that's that. But people are coming in from all sorts of things out there, and we cannot hold everyone else to the same standard we hold ourselves to. It's a different story if someone were to come into the faith after this and then try and start going down these paths, and we still probably have to have long conversations because people aren't black and white either. There's all sorts of things that can go on in one's life, and so we just have to treat the people, the patients that we are given as they are, and try as best we can to bring everyone to Christ, because He ultimately is the great physician that will heal everything. So, does that make sense?
I guess the other one too would, when you got approached in the street, because obviously like this one you're also talking about those that have like the earnestness to come to the church. What about like outside and there's somebody like they obviously they see your robe and they're transgender themselves. It's like what's like your most like pastoral response to them saying like what do you think?
What I was taught in seminary was when someone introduces themselves as something out there, go with it. Right? People go by nicknames all the time. It doesn't matter. How many people here know of someone in this community that was baptized one thing and goes by a different name? Right? Now, if they're coming into the church, then we'll have some conversations, right? But if I'm just talking to a cashier, again, what good does it do, especially when I'm dressed like this, to put my foot down about something that I'm never going to talk to them about again, ever, right? It's just going to turn them off from the whole thing for basically no good reason. So whatever they introduce themselves as, fine. Even if it's sort of obvious that that's probably not what they were born as. Okay, right? Not the end of the world.
But it also just probably ties into you're just showing them love and mercy. It's like if that's what like the first step maybe for them, okay, like you said, like all right, well you're not getting a response or he's actually not hateful. It's just that building stone, like okay, well maybe over time, however long it takes, maybe they'll start opening up a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, very much so. It's again, it's important to remember that we're talking about people. People are complex and they have feelings too. So even if they don't look the way we expect them to, they're still people and we still have to see the image and likeness in Christ in them, which there is nothing we can do to get rid of. We have that image of Christ, of God within us. So treat them, see the Christ in them and respond to that no matter how they introduce themselves. Anything else?
It's a recurrent theme. So like I think
I know.
theme at that one. No, like I think like from what I'm understanding from all of these though so far at least it's not judgment, but it's also not accepting it, but it's the mercy of it and the humbleness of ourselves since we have.
But maybe let me phrase it this way. When someone asks you what do you think about whatever, the response is, I'm not going to do that. I'm an Orthodox Christian. I don't believe that that is a good thing for me to do. Right? That's another person. It's not your position to be judging that person, right? God is the judge, not any of us. And so, we won't do those things because we hold ourselves to a different standard. But people out there are going to do whatever they're going to do. They have their own standards. Sometimes it's a standard that's a cultural thing within whatever group they're in. Sometimes it's their own. But whatever. They have their own different standard they hold themselves to. And we can't just brute force our standard onto that and expect that to go well. So, yeah.
I guess that'd be a better one too. Try to avoid like a whole seminary of why we think the way you think. That's just.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I dress like this most of the time when I go out. I haven't, people don't just like come up to me and ask me about these things. The few times that I've had people come up and ask, it's like, are you a priest? And then they move on. And that's pretty much it. The reality is, I think it has nothing to do with Christianity. I think it has everything to do with some of the other large religions that we see coming into the US right now, and have been for the past several decades, is we've been very much trained to say, well, if a woman is wearing a full covering from head to toe, that's her decision and choice to do so. And don't go up and start judging her for that, right? You might not agree with it, you're not going to do it, but if that's what she's doing, that's what she's doing, right? And we've been kind of trained as a culture to just kind of let the people do their thing, as long as they're not like going out and making a big stink about it. So don't go out and make a big stink about it, right? Don't be like those groups that will go out and, picket funerals or something like that. There's no reason to do that. But hold yourself to that standard. And if someone does ask you, then that standard is for us. And if they would like to join, well, then we'll have a conversation about what it looks like for them, because we never keep the standard exactly and completely, no matter what it is we're talking about. There are always going to be individual circumstances, and talk to your spiritual father. Well, science, I imagine with this particular group, maybe this is a little less of a conversation than some of the groups I've had here, but I want to make it very clear, science is not a religion. It's just not a religion. These are two different things. Many of the great saints that we read about, the prolific writers, they were very well versed in the sciences of their time. They wrote about how the church supports those sciences, or vice versa, right? They were very well aware. There are Saint Luke of Simferopol, I think is his name. The Blessed Surgeon was a very well-renowned surgeon in the Soviet Union, and he pioneered several. I'm trying to remember what exactly. Several forms of surgery that we still use to this day. He was very well educated. He was so well regarded as a doctor that despite leaving that behind to be a bishop, the government begged him to come back and continue being a doctor because he was very good at it. Right? I currently know clergy that before they went to seminary worked in research labs, writing papers about stuff. One of them even specifically on like the mRNA stuff, right? And they left not because of anything related to that, but just because they felt called to the priesthood. And in this community, we have at least one, maybe two doctors, at least that I'm aware of, maybe more. This is not a separate thing from religion. Science and religion are two sides of effectively the same coin, right? We can very much say that God created all things and then dive into the rules of physics that define the world he made. That's okay. It doesn't change the fact that God made it just because we have an equation that defines how that thing works, right? I think that's enough, unless anyone has any specific questions there. I mean,
I do actually.
Both of them,
I know that there's, so for context, I came from a church, or worked for a church for 10 years that was very into the theistic evolution, and like kind of proposed that and worked with an organization that's kind of their whole thing, is to sort of try to, not debunk creationism, but just sort of like present a different perspective. And I see those dichotomies even already within the Orthodox Church. There's some people that are very like hardcore creationists, and some people that are like theistically evolutionary minded. I don't have a dog in that fight. That's not why I'm in the Orthodox Church, but I'm just curious to know like your perspective on that.
Sure.
Yeah, from an
Well,
Orthodox perspective.
my perspective is they are different things. So we don't have dogmas in the Orthodox Church or canons or anything like that that defines the things we must believe about science. You are free to become a geologist or archaeologist or whatever and come to your own conclusions about those things. I will very briefly state an opinion you can find within the Orthodox world, which is God created the world in 7 days. The sun was not created until a little while into those days, so what the heck is a day for God? So clearly the world was doing stuff for quite a while before we were around. And other than humans, if you look at the text in Genesis, how does life come forth on the earth?
Through dust, right?
How does God make the things on the earth?
Like he speaks it into existence, is that what you're saying?
Sort of.
Making me realize I need to go back and read Genesis.
He commands the earth to bring forth life. It does not say in Genesis that he sat down and made every plant and creature. In fact, the only thing that it calls that out for is humans. Everything else, it says he commanded the earth or the sea to bring forth life, and it did so. Obviously, he's still involved in that process. It's not like we don't subscribe to the, what is it, the watchmaker or whatever the name for that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, where he just like sets stuff up and then it just kind of does its own thing. We very much believe he's active in his creation, even to this day. But all that to say, as you pointed out rightly, there are different opinions within the Orthodox Church, and it is okay to have either of those,
Yeah.
because what is the most important thing?
Following Christ.
Following Christ. Right? The rest of these things are great. I mean, it's wonderful to have something to fill your time with. It's wonderful to get to know more about God's creation and to theorize about how he may have done these things. Fine, great. But there's no reason to get dogmatic about it. Right? We know that Genesis tells us that God made everything. That's really what we're supposed to take away from Genesis. If you read, for like example, St. John Chrysostom, he's very clear about how we cannot take Genesis too literally, because it also says that he walks with them, with Adam and Eve in the garden. But he didn't have legs and feet to walk with at that point. He wasn't in flesh until much later, so until after the fall. So what was he walking on? He didn't have legs and feet, right? So, and he actually spends several chapters talking about that. He felt very strongly about the fact that we cannot take Genesis too literally. And that instead, what we're supposed to take from Genesis is that by God's action and involvement, all things were made, including humans, including everything else out there, right? God made all of that. And that's kind of it.
Yeah, biblical literalism seems like a more modern thing, actually, more than it is an ancient thing.
You do see some groups that tend a little more that way. The allegory was something that St. John Chrysostom was actually well known for at the time. His school of thought was much more allegorical than some of the others at the time. But, yeah, you don't really see a lot of people that just, well, it says this, so clearly that is the only way it could possibly be.
I remember St. Gregory's, one of his orations was, I think, touching on Genesis, but how don't look at the words literally. I think he was like naming stuff like when it talks about him waking or stretching out his hands. I think he's not actually doing those. I think he even lists like it's a metaphor for something else that's active, but it's not like God sleeping on you. That's what nothing's happening. but like he clearly points out, like he said, like, well, maybe we're looking at it too literally. Like a day is 24 hours in a day. Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Oh, sure, yeah, no, it's helpful. I mean, I would agree with everything you just said, but I'm just sort of curious, because coming into the Orthodox Church, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, there's people here who like really have a strong opinion about it being like, you know, basically creationism, essentially, and then there's some people that seem like they're much more nuanced, and there's some people that are theistically evolutionarily minded, so whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that we can't compromise on is to say that God is involved in his creation
Yeah.
from the beginning until now. And whatever process that takes, he has a hand in some way, shape, or form. Right? We very much do not believe that, I think it's watchmaker, clockmaker, something like that. Sets up a bunch of rules and processes and then just kind of lets it run wild and sits back and watches it do its thing. Right? That's not what we believe. He's active in his creation. He's active in our lives. Right? So, but beyond that, yeah, as long as you're not saying anything too heretical, probably. But again, science is not religion, so there are no canons or dogmas about these things. I know there are certain people, even certain online people that like to talk about these things that will come very hard on one side or the other of these things. And the reality is, as maybe you've picked up a little bit here, it's just not the most important thing, right? It's okay to think about. It's okay to have an opinion on, of course, but it's really not the most important thing. Right? If you can live a good life in Christ, then I feel very firmly that whether or not you believe in one form of evolution or another or not at all or whatever is really secondary to a life you live in Christ. All right. I want to talk a little bit about family planning because this is another thing that we run into a lot, both in and out of the Orthodox world. It is important to understand that we generally, I'll read the last little bit here first and then we'll go back to the top of this paragraph. Generally speaking, we don't consider preventing conception to be a good thing. However, it may be the best option for the family involved. There comes a time where you simply cannot feed another mouth. And bringing another child in is going to mean that they have a terrible upbringing, that they are forgotten and ignored, that they are scarred and emotionally traumatized by your lack of parenting of them. Is that really a good thing? Is that really what you should be doing? So it may not be ideal, but it may be the best option. Children should be raised in healthy, spiritually nourishing households. If you can't provide that, then you really need to have a conversation with your spiritual father about if you even should really be having children now. Because the thing is, if God wants you to have kids, you'll have kids at some point. There are very few methods, although there are a few technically, that have a truly 100% rate of preventing conception. Most of the normally used forms of contraception are not 100%. They're very nearly 100%. Statistically, they might as well be for most people. Maybe not statistically. Practically, for most people, they might as well be. But when you look at the actual numbers, they're not technically. There are instances where something can happen, right? If God wants something to happen, it's going to happen, right? I hope I don't need to say that. But the reality is, we have long lives, right? Just because you're not able to have kids right now doesn't mean that in a few years you might not be in a wildly different situation. It's okay to just put that off for a little bit. There is nowhere that you will find in any piece of scripture or any writing of the saint, at least that I'm aware of, that says the moment you become able to bear children, you should bear as many of them as you're able until you die. That's just not there, right? That's not a teaching of the church. It's certainly not something you find from any of the fathers, or it's not like Paul writes about that in his letter to whomever, right? It's just not the teaching of the church. Now, as I said, it is ideal to not do that. It is ideal to have the children that God gives you. But there comes a time when you just can't have more. And maybe you can't have any, right? And that's okay. It may be the best option in that, in your situation, to just not. Or again, to wait a little bit. That is okay. And I want to be very clear, just in case someone thinks that this is just my own opinion. This is something that I promise is not. This is something that you will find in some form or fashion at most, if not all, Orthodox churches, right? there are certainly different ways of saying this. Some will be a little stronger about one way or another, but the reality is, like your fasting rule, like your prayer rule, your life is really not your own. It's God's. It's Christ's. And so whenever we go through these big life decisions, right? You don't get married without talking to your spiritual father. Don't have kids without talking to your spiritual father, right? I don't need to know the details about when and how, obviously. Please don't tell me that. It's not helpful for me or you. But if you feel like this isn't an option for you right now, realistically, then okay, maybe it's not an option for you right now. We can discuss what that might look like. I will come out a little strong here and say it is my own opinion that the quiverful movement is wrong. I know there are Orthodox people online that feel very strongly about that. If you don't know what that is, that's fine. Basically, it's the idea that you should have, like I said before, as many children as you can possibly have to fill your quiver. It's not, that's not what that means. That's not what that is supposed to be telling you to do. It is not a direction. It is not a command that you have as many children as your quiver can carry. The reality is, it's hard on women to have children. It's life-threatening, even in the U.S., in a theoretically first world country, right? A woman's life is put on the line every time she has a child. Not everyone is okay with that. Not everyone is able to do that. So, it's okay if you have to wait a little bit. It's okay if there comes a point where you just gotta be done, because you just gotta be done, right? We should be providing healthy, spiritually nurturing households. And if that is in jeopardy, talk to your spiritual father.
What about for stuff like the IVF and like, it's not, you're not able to have a natural birth and you have to have those types of procedures?
So, theoretically, we don't have anything too against that. The problem with the way IVF is done in the US is that, I think, if I recall, this is a US thing. So it's not true everywhere. The way that it's done in the US is a number of eggs are collected and fertilized all at once. And then basically the most viable is implanted.
Oh, wow.
Which means there are potentially quite a few more that have been fertilized and then you just dispose of them.
Oh, wow.
We have a problem with that. But that's not my understanding, at least. I'm not a physician. I'm not really in the medical world at all. But my understanding is that's not the case everywhere, but it tends to be more expensive because you may have to do it several times. Because the reality is, many conceptions aren't viable, even perfectly natural ones. I don't remember the exact statistic, but a surprisingly high percentage of conceptions, and long before anyone is even remotely aware that that happened. It's just the reality of how that process works, that only the few and the strong survive, and it might take a little while sometimes. So anyway, that's the general thought there, at least in the U.S. All right, I don't want to take too much longer. We've only got two more. We're getting close to time, but I want to talk very quickly about suicide. We already talked about what the unforgivable sin is, so that means suicide is not that. Right. The reason is the church has had different opinions on this, but we have a much better understanding of suicide these days than we did in the past. And again, most people that go that path aren't doing so happily. It's a mental condition. It's a problem. I remember in one of our classes we were specifically warned that if we know someone is suicidal, that we need to be very careful about entering their home, because if they have abandoned care for their own life, then usually that means they've abandoned care for all life, and they would have no problem lashing out at you if you're trying to prevent them from taking their own life, for example. You're not in your right mind, and to imply that God is without power to save this person is to limit God, which So we have to acknowledge that a mental health problem is a very different prospect from saying, well, I didn't choose to be in this world, but gosh darn it, I'm going to choose to not be in it anymore, right? And then you take much drugs or something. I think we could conceive of some situation where it is purely out of spite and somehow you'd be cleared by a doctor that you just hate a lot or something, I don't know. But the reality is for most people, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people that are deeply hurting, usually that have a long period of trauma leading up to whatever ultimately causes them to take their life. And to ignore that and just say, no, that's that, is wrong. There's a problem, or an error here. It says that we give baptisms, funerals is what that word should be. The Orthodox Church will give full funerals to people who take their life. It is a mental health issue. There is a little bit of back and forth sometimes with the bishop in case there's question or if there are details about the situation that aren't known. But like I said, statistically, most of the time, this is a long form of trauma that is built up to a particular event. And oftentimes, if you talk to survivors of suicide attempts, they talk about how they weren't themselves and how deeply grateful they were for the person who saved them. So, I think it's very important to acknowledge that and remember that when we talk about this. Makes sense? Good. All right. And then talk about voting. We've talked about a lot of other things. This one, it maybe feels a little less of a big deal, but I don't know, maybe not. It depends on the person. The most important thing I can say about this is this country does not matter. It just doesn't. This country will fall long before the church does, and there's nothing any of us can do to stop that. Whether it's this particular president or the next one, or if this country morphs into some other form of governance and 1,000 years from now it falls, whatever, it will fall before the church does. If the U.S. collapses tomorrow, I will still be doing liturgy this Sunday just the same. Probably won't mention the president and government of this country anymore, if there isn't one to be commemorating, but other than that, we're still going to do the services like we always do, right? So, it really doesn't matter what political movement you are a part of, or party, or system, or anything like that, right? We obviously try to do the best we can to be Christ-like, but as long as you are earnestly doing that, it really doesn't matter how you vote. I have known very, very wonderful people in this country that voted one way and the other. You may have your own opinions on people that vote one way or the other, and okay, but remember who the ultimate judge is. So, we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So,
like a legal authority, basically?
So in some places it's a legal requirement to vote. Okay, vote. Here we have a choice to vote or not vote. Okay, I would argue that you probably should vote as a civic duty, as rendering under Caesar what is his. But you don't have to. It's your right in this country to not. So if you don't want to, don't. It's okay. I will say public political expression is usually not something we endorse. So you will never hear me in any public way, at least, say anything about any candidate. I'm just not going to. That's not what we do. You'll never hear a bishop. Well, I shouldn't say never, but
Some countries might say otherwise.
Yeah.
generally speaking, you're not going to hear clergy, bishop, priest, anything like that go off about political people. But that's just not what we're about. It's about Christ, right? And as long as you are doing your best to follow him, as long as you are emulating him, loving those in need, the hungry and the poor and the naked and the imprisoned and the infirm and the right, as long as you're doing your best to minister to those people, the rest of it is all secondary. So, vote. Vote out. Vote blue, vote red, vote third party, fine. Again, I think, in my own opinion, I think we probably should all. I think it's our duty as citizens in this government, in this land, to do that. I am a Christian first, but I am still an American citizen, right? I still have a passport. I still have to interact with the government, so it's okay for me to vote. But if you don't want to, fine. It's okay. Make sense?
But like the bigger maybe issue that is not necessarily the voting, but you encountered an Orthodox Christian that was, let's say, like a civic official in the government, and they were running on platforms that are very anti-Orthodox. It's just
So
a question.
generally speaking, we are not, clergy are not allowed to hold civil office. Lay people certainly can. Yes, if you were calling yourself an Orthodox Christian and then campaigning for all sorts of nonsense, yeah, don't vote for them just because they're Orthodox, right? I mean, that's just as I said we don't have to vote, you don't have to vote for them, so you can just not. It's not like you're obligated to because they're Orthodox. What would be up with that individual is going to be between them and their spiritual mother. Probably if they're campaigning on a bunch of non-Orthodox stuff, I sure hope they're going to confession regularly. Who knows? Not my place to step in unless they're my parishioners. Sense of that?
Yeah, like that's what it basically like. Again, it's like just because you see that person in Maryland doing something, don't get riled up about it. Because like you said, the main message is Christ-centered.
Yeah.
If somebody's doing something in DC, sure, it may be. I mean, we see all the time. There's a lot of very unchristian things out there, but I think that the big one I get from all these too is it's more of these are issues that you tackle yourself, and then basically handle those. And then sure, if you come across things that if somebody, I guess, wants more information on it, you can open up about them.
Sure.
Because I don't really even see like I see some videos of Orthodox clergy like in San Francisco or New York like that do like prayers in front of the abortion clinic and stuff. But I mean, like, there's so few though. Like I don't see like massive rallies like you would see like in Protestants, like like you said, like with abortion stuff and get riled up about it.
And those that do tend to take the stance that it is less about making a big stink as it is making it known to people that there are other opinions. That they're not doing it because if they don't, then everyone there is going to hell, right? That's not the point. The point of doing these things is to allow there to be a discussion by helping people to see that there are different opinions, that we're not all united on this, which is, I think, part of why it's not like a thing we all do. There are some, but certainly not everyone. And yes, like you said, it's mostly about ourselves, as we said on the front, right? He was without sin, cast the first stone. So hold yourself to these standards and let the Lord work out how He needs to with everyone else. Just to end real quick, and then we can move back if there are more questions. So, we treat people with love and compassion, right? That's what we see in the gospel again and again and again and again and again. Not to hate people, but to see the image of Christ within them, and to treat that respectfully and honorably. We don't support things that are opposed to the church, right? So don't go out of your way to be helping something from here, whatever that may look like. These are all very different things, so there'd be very different ways of helping any one of them, but don't go out of your way to be supporting bad things. But certainly, we give freely to anyone who asks, right? How many times does Jesus interrogate the person in front of him to figure out if they are deserving of his mercy and compassion? Of course he's God. He knows whether they're deserving or not, but everything he's doing is for our benefit so that we can emulate him. He doesn't do that, right? He just sees a person in need and he helps them. That is what we are to do. We pray for the world, all of the people in it, not just the ones we like. We give to all who ask freely. We set aside whatever little in-groups and out-groups we like to associate with, and unite ourselves to Christ, first and foremost. Everything else All right, that's the end, and I think that's more or less time. But as always, there are further questions.
It would also be like more of a call into, instead of political action, just mental health and community too. Because I think one time we talked about too, it's like more of the duty, even like the church, not even just the invisible church of all around the world, but that one in particular to help your community. So like what, again, like what good would it do if you're going hammering all these points to the whole world when your community itself needs your service? Or
If you're walking past Lazarus at the gate to go do things in the Capitol building, then you've failed from the get-go. Right?
But what you also said, there is some calling for, are those that would be in the government, like there is some things and like that, but I'm assuming you would probably still more, not stress, but advise them, more help would be at the house, or not the house, but in your community then. Like if God calls you to the country government to do stuff, then yeah, but from what I see, it's always so much more that your own community
Sure.
right at home.
Yeah, there are always going to be those that are called to higher levels of government. I mean, within the church, right? There's the majority of people that go to the local church and support the ministries there. There are bishops that have a broader territory, and then there's the Metropolitan Patriarch, whatever you want to call them, who's got a much larger area. But the farther up the chain you go, the fewer people there are on each of those rungs, right? There are certainly people that are called to those ministries, but not everyone. You can do a lot of good from a national level, so to speak, but we could also do a lot of good just right here. It makes a big difference donating to your local food bank. Whatever we may do for programs on the national level, if your food bank doesn't have food, then there's only so much they can do. So that's why we've got food collection here, and many churches do. They'll do collection drives for all sorts of stuff. Right now, we've also got one going on right now for school supplies and stuff like that. Right? It's very local support for the community need around you. Anything else?
We're getting a little bit off now. I feel like there could be a little couple more in there.
I hope I didn't scandalize anyone. I know that some of these are not exactly what you hear online, but again, the most important thing is following Christ and emulating the love he showed for everyone.
Yeah, I think that maybe that's the tough part. Like, not say that's the tough part, but because I think maybe when we think of the guidelines of the church, it's like you have to live it even so much publicly too. So I guess that's why maybe that's why the questions aren't popping up too much, is because it's like we're thinking of all these hypotheticals and what each situation, but I mean that's why like I kind of answer my own self whenever I have like questions of what to do as well. What's like the best one to emulate Christ in that situation? So that was kind of like, it's like, well, what would you do? Well, would that be like the best representation of Christ and to those? Because whenever I think of even like the martyrs, they're not a lot of them. Like it was a couple times we talk about miracles of the church and all these, or even like on Saturday, great Vespers, you talk about the unmercenaries. Like a lot of those people you don't know about. Like, because I know at work, I have a friend I was talking about a lot about the saints, and that's just always these questions like, why don't you hear about these people? And I'm telling like, well, because they don't go around posting about it, you know. And I told him like his favorite one right now is St. Paisios. He's like, well, why would nobody else like? Because I don't even think anybody, even probably the next monastery over, probably even knew what St. Paisios was doing. It's just a humble thing that these things are doing, and like all the time we hear in the divine liturgies, Christ does these things, but he's not saying, all right, now send a messenger to King Herod himself, telling him what I just did to make sure that he knows that I'm the Messiah and so forth. So that's why I guess that always answers the questions of what to do in those ones, preserving the life and everything else that goes on though. Because I think that's the problem too, is like we always maybe so much want them to live the truth that we've come to know. And
Well, I think the problem is that we want a simple solution. And so if we can just say, this thing is bad, never do this thing, that's easy, right? It's easy to remember, it's easy to rally behind and scream in other people's faces. But the reality is, that's rarely how things work. And so I get questions all the time. Is this a sin? That's kind of hard for me to say. What's the circumstance? What are we talking about? Objectively speaking, that's probably not a great thing. But given your circumstance, that might be understandable, and that might be the best you can do right now. And maybe in a few years you can work towards something a little better, but that might be leaps and bounds ahead of where you were before, in which case, yeah, that's great. There's a story I tell sometimes of a monk. Unfortunately, I've blanked a lot of the identifying details of it, but monk in a monastery in Monathos that was known, he lived sort of like a hermit outside the monastery grounds. He's known by the brothers of the monastery because he got pretty drunk pretty much every day. And because of that, he was not well liked. There's a lot of talking down to him and about him. And finally he died. There was some murmurings amongst the brethren about, good riddance kind of thing. And the abbot finally stepped forward and said, what you all don't realize is the trauma that he went through in his early life that led him to drinking at an extremely young age, such that he formed a very strong chemical bond as a child with an addictive substance. And when he first came to the monastery, long before most of you were here, he drank way more. What you knew him to be consuming on a regular basis was way less than he had been when he first came into the monastery. He made immense strides towards putting this behind him. And he ultimately wasn't able to completely put it behind him by the end of his life. But compared to where he was before, he was so much better. And so you can look at that and say, well, is it okay to have 3 drinks in the morning every day? And I'm going to say no. But in his circumstance, that was way better than what it had been before, right? So that's the situation ethics thing that we talked about at the beginning, right? It's very hard to give a definitive answer in almost any broad question like that without knowing the person and where they're coming from and what they're struggling with and all these kinds of things. Which is why the advice so frequently is, go talk to your spiritual father. Figure it out with him, right? Because when your spiritual father understands you and the position you're coming from and whatever, then he can give you a recommendation about what you need to be doing. It's not just a blanket statement about this thing or that thing. There are a few things, right? I go back to murder all the time because it's such an iconic thing. It's very easy to just say murder is bad. But then we just talked about today in certain situations where it may be the better option, right? So, I mean, and certainly, we didn't go too far into it, but I mean, if someone's attacking you and you defend yourself and without intending to end up killing them, right? That's a very different situation. So, right, it's a very clear-cut thing until it isn't anymore. And that's situation ethics for you. So.
I guess the other, because I know I would get this from my aunt when she brings it up, that she's on the one political spectrum where abortion is okay with her. And so how would you respond again to her when she says in case of rape and incest and so forth? Because it's the life of life, but it's like, when she's like, when you said like, I think also this society where too much is, makes it black and white, so it's life to life to her, it's like, well, that's not so good.
I would say the same thing I've said in a lot of these situations. Every individual is different, right? For me to make any blanket statement about this is going to be ignoring some instance where it's not true. So the way to deal with it is to talk with the person and see what makes sense for them. Oftentimes when we talk about this, what we mean is young children, right? Unfortunately, a high percentage of incest cases are with kids because it's much easier to persuade them and convince them that something is right that isn't. And unfortunately, statistically, most sexual misconduct with kids is from family members. That's a terrible statistic and I hate it, but that's the way it is. So maybe there exists some circumstance where with enough family support, that could be done in a way that allowed the child to be born. But my goodness, is that a huge commitment, right? One that is probably not going to happen a lot of the time, because the other unfortunate statistic is that most of the time, when the family becomes aware of these types of things, they try to bury them. Try to pretend like they didn't happen and don't exist. And that is not a situation conducive to assisting your child in raising their own child. So,
Situation difference.
exactly.
It reminds me of this idea of economia as well, with like with councils, how certain sort of canons are expressed in context, right?
Yeah.
That's been very helpful for me to parse through. That idea of economia has been very helpful to parse through most of what you may or may not hear out there in the world. And so I like that approach. It seems very wise.
I guess the other one on that one would just be, when that happens, it's not like everybody just shuns her. I would assume the whole parish would, if she's in the Orthodox Church, and that, unfortunately, I'm sure that whole parish would support her in that terrible instance too.
I mean, they should.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I hope so. Which I think a lot of people would hear that and be like, oh, I think, because a lot of people just think you do it, you're shunned, but that's like the very American Christianity version of it, like, you did that, it's terrible, or you did that and it's like, it's freedom or whatever like that, but again,
I have known young women that had a child conceived definitely out of wedlock. And then they got married, but the child was, the community did reject them, did shun them, did ostracize them. We aren't going to try and say that it was a good thing that things happened in that order, but it's not the child's fault, certainly, right? And the mother still needs assistance in bearing and raising that child, so what good does it do to punt them to the street and say, good luck, have fun?
yeah. Well, it was like what you were saying, like you touched on earlier, it's like, well, if you did that, how would you help that person's salvation if the church that they're going to, the church is supposed to be the hospital?
Well, and in that case, not just them, but now we're talking about a child too.
Yeah.
What is the child gonna look back on if they are ultimately born and the church community shunned the mother and kicked them out of the community and whatever? They're never gonna wanna step foot in an Orthodox church if that was their experience of their mother's pregnancy and giving birth. So,
Because I think probably would also, would they assume too, like, not assume, but it'd be like, this is church, even like I said, the young girl that unfortunately had that happen to him, in those prayers, we would all probably say like, God has mercy on that child, the unborn one. So, like you said, there's not black and white, there's a lot of depth to it, which I think is probably what's missing a lot nowadays, it's either this or that, and you're either good or you're bad.
yeah.
Do you think that part of why the Western Christian paradigm is kind of partially so legalistic is because of scholasticism and because of the kind of overly mechanical way of thinking about like X equals Y and Z, like formalizing things?
Sure. I mean, you have to be a little careful because we're talking about a very broad category. And there are certainly those within that aren't legalistic. And I mean, even taking the example I think a lot of people jump to in the Catholic Church, there are plenty of groups within the Catholic Church that are a lot less that way, a lot less legalistic, and a lot more focused on Christ and loving the way that Christ showed us to love. But sure, I do think that having for such a long time this focus on treating a lot of things as very juridical, right and wrong, and or good or bad or whatever, tends to lead to more black and white thinking. You have either transgressed the law or you have not, right? You've either broken the rule or you're fine.
What are the like earlier church fathers sort of what's the shape of how reconciliation, like people have sinned and then come back.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so there was an early heresy that is called a heresy that said that those who renounced faith on pain of death, because the early church was sort of brutal for those that were Christian. The church wasn't, but the civil leadership was sort of brutal. So it wasn't uncommon to have people that were found out, and then they'd be like, oh no, I renounce that, and say something, offer sacrifice to the pagan gods or whatever, fine. And then later, either when the persecution calms down, or when they move somewhere else that's not quite so strong on the persecution thing, or just they repent and realize what they did, they try and come back, and this particular group said, no, no, you rejected, that's it, you're done. We called it heresy. We said, no, you can come back. Clergy can be clergy still. It's not ideal that you're doing these things, but better that you end back in the church and work on your salvation there than dying in a pit of despair out there, having no recourse to come back to Christ. So,
So there was it seems like there really was a position of sort of taking compassionate, merciful towards finding a way for people to come back into a life in Christ.
Yep. Yeah, and even things like I briefly touched on the public confessions. We look at that now and we go, oh my goodness, well wouldn't that just mean that no one ever says anything? But like I was trying to get at the moment, right? The point of this was because these were the sins that were affecting the community. And by confessing them publicly, so not all confession was done publicly, but those things that were affecting the community being done publicly allowed the community to heal and to come back together and be stronger because of it. So, there's very much an understanding that people fail. They gotta come back somehow. The church keeps the door open. You may slam it shut. The church is going to keep it open.
Yeah, because I remember one of those I think St. Basil's, and when I was looking up the position of death and when it came to warfare and stuff, I think he was one of the ones that said, yeah, it's not inherent it's a sin, but he still, I think he recommended they don't have communion still for 3 or 4 years, not because it wasn't, not because what they did was in itself because they were doing it in defense or because of their army they commanded to. That one sin, but it was because it was the spiritual damage that it did.
Yeah.
That's why it's taken time to, when you're talking about reconciliation, it was that time for them to be nurtured and then bring back into the church. Because it wasn't like you said, they weren't excommunicated because something in the church said no. It's just this was just murder's murder. It's very deep, but like you said, the specific circumstance, it wasn't. You could say as bad, but it was more about what it did to the soul of that person.
Yeah, I didn't really talk on that as much this time. Certainly in the catechumen class when we talk about confession, I dive into it a little more. But we tend to talk about the church being a hospital and about sin being a disease. And so that's why I can confidently say that some of these things are sins and not ideal, but they may be the best thing, but you should still go to confession, right? Because it still impacts us. It still hurts. Things can still be bad, even if it was the best choice, even if that was what felt like the only reasonable option amidst a bunch of bad things. It's still going to hurt, so you still go to confession, and there still may be consequences, but not because you broke the law, and now I have to give you the punishment, but because you're sick and I'm giving you the medicine that will help you heal. And you can choose to not take that medicine if you want, but it's likely going to make your recovery a lot longer and more difficult and maybe even impossible depending on the situation, right? So.
It's amazing. Penance versus, like you said, physician. Which one's the two different worlds, the scholastic is penance. To me, it always
We use the
more
word
physician.
penance, but I don't like it because of the implication that we find elsewhere.
The ties to that, the other more harsh one.
But, it's, for example, if a married couple decides that they need to end it and get divorced, and not because of some horrible, awful thing, but just, it's just not working, right? Okay, well, the church will allow for that, but the reality is, you're probably, I mean, depending on the priest or the situation and yada, 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 probably it's going to be recommended that both husband, or now ex-husband and wife, refrain from communion for, I think it's 40 days. And again, different priests, different situations, different people, etc. But not because you've broken the law, but because you don't have to figure out all of everything on your own, right? I've been married for a number of years now. I have to figure out a heck of a lot of stuff if I don't have another person around to be doing half of the things, right? So there's just a very practical side of, it's going to be more difficult for me to be staying on top of my affairs because I'm kind of, maybe not relearning per se, but re-reminding myself that, oh yeah, I have to do that thing, right? It's gonna take some time to find that new norm. And I probably won't be able to fully prepare for communion like I should be until I've kind of reestablished that norm. And so, okay, the church lifts that burden of trying to prepare and just says, focus on the other things you need to focus on right now. Come back when you're ready and we'll be here, right?
I guess that was kind of tied into like the concept that I've been seeing a lot, especially with the church fathers, with the term like theosis, where it's a lot of, I guess, which is why it's so much different from like my Catholic upbringing is, yeah, like, I mean, you said like sins, we're missing the mark, so missing the mark, it just requires like more guidance and help, but the Catholic role is like, your penance, you're gonna suffer, this is your judgment, but I don't get that like that in Orthodoxy at all, because like, especially with all the things we're talking about, like, these are all very much missing the mark, but like you said, that's not your chance to miss out on salvation, because you just missed the mark really bad, but you still have the opportunity from like a pastor, like pastoral guidance, to come back into a line with Christ.
Yep.
So that would be basic theosis, like that free will to come back in. Sometimes you just need a little help to get over there.
So you need a lot of help. But
Yeah, sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Like I said, you spoke with the story of the monastic in Athos, like, sure he was struggling a lot, but I mean, who knows where he would have been at without any help at all, though.
Sure.
If they just kind of just threw him out. And,
I mean, he was clearly a monk, so.
yeah.
He was on a better path,
Yeah.
at least than just figuring out all out in the world.
Yeah.
Or just taking them on. And I think that's the other one that we get a lot from these lessons too is, like, I think you had it in there in the beginning, it's very much community based, you're helping each other, it's not this, and I see that a lot too, especially with like the Gospels too, like there's Christ, but there's so much like help of everybody along the way though too. I mean, obviously you have the ultimate helper is Christ with everybody, but even all the early church fathers, it gets very much a group thing that we're doing, like nobody's doing this on their own.
Yep.
If you did it on your own, wow, hey, congrats to you somehow though. Hope there's a biography on them, maybe. Say about the Anthony or something like that.
All right. That's very much time now. So I don't want to go too much later because it's getting close to 8. But you of course have my contact information. So if there were other questions, you can feel free to message me or